Hi, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Mama Project podcast. Today, I have Holly Covas here. She is a medical laboratory science program director. But the reason why she's coming on this show today is to talk about her own personal experience with two basically unexplained miscarriages in between both of her children and how she decided to do some digging and basically use her knowledge to figure out what causes these miscarriages from a laboratory science perspective, and like what kind of tests doctors should order in order to see what's going on. So Holly, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation.
And just before we hopped on, Holly was going to like get into her story. So I'm like, wait, let's hit record because I know that everybody else is going to want to hear this. So Holly has two children, but I know in between both of her children, she had two miscarriages. So talk about that personal experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So, my first pregnancy, no problem. Didn't try. It just was very natural, organic, no problems whatsoever. Um, Healthy, happy child. And then so a few years later, we decided, my ex-husband and I were like, okay, let's go for the next one. And I was towards the end of my first trimester, about 14, 15 weeks at that point. And I was working at the hospital. I started having blood clots. I started bleeding. And so since I was already at the hospital, I called my doctor and he said, go downstairs to the ER. So I did, right? And I sat there for hours before they would see me because unfortunately, a miscarriage isn't quote unquote an emergency. So when I did go back to my room, they did the test. They confirmed that I was still pregnant, and they said, "Okay, well, you're just not quite as far along as you thought." They said, "You're a few weeks behind what you thought." And I said, "Well, that's odd." But they told me I could go back to work. I verified, do I need to have any type of restrictions? They said, don't lift anything too heavy. And then a week after that, it started again. I started bleeding. So I went back downstairs to the ER because I was at work again. And then the nurse practitioner said, well, you're only about 4 weeks along. And she hadn't done an ultrasound or anything. And I said, well, that's impossible, because if that was the case, I would have had a positive pregnancy test a month, a couple of months before I was even pregnant. And so I said, no, I've miscarried. And she said, well, you don't know that. And I said, yeah, I do. This is partly what I do, in my job. And so she did an ultrasound and found that there was no heartbeat. And so that was the first one. And the doctor came in with, I know it's one of those situations where they're trying to be supportive, but he came in and said, well, there's nothing you can do. And and it's just one of those, it's very weighted, and one of those things where you think, oh, maybe there is, maybe there should be, maybe, what's going on. um so yeah, that was the first one. And then a little bit more time goes by, and the second one basically went the exact same way. I was nearing the end of my first trimester, and I started bleeding. And that's what really prompted me into figuring out what the cause was. And I went to my OBGYN, and I had all of these ideas, and I said, do you think it could be any of these? And he said, I don't know. He said, I want to send you to a specialist. And that's really where I started to realize that doctors didn't necessarily have all the answers. And so I started really becoming more of an advocate for myself.
Wow, that's amazing and also like kind of heavy, right? Like to hear just that the first one, it was just you were just like, well, there's nothing you can do. Try
Yeah.
again. Like. But I'm sure you had to, like how really did you cope with that loss? Like did you was it Were you just like, okay, well, we'll just try again? Or were you just like, oh, well, these things happen? Like, you know, the statistics, right? Like, you know that
Right.
it's like 1 in 4 women. So were you just kind of like matter of fact about it at that point? Or were you like, not until your second one were you like, okay, no, I need to figure this out?
Oh no, I fell apart. I absolutely, because it's one of those things where um you can hear the statistics and you can say, well, I'm not going to get my hopes up, but once you have that experience, and especially because I was getting into the second trimester, we always hear, well, the first trimester is the most risk, and once you get past that, it's fine. Once you get past 8-10 weeks, everything's usually fine. And so with that, I didn't leave the house for a week. I didn't. After the second one, because they kind of went the same way, I was a bit more matter of fact about it, because at that point I had a mission. At that point, I wanted to find out the cause.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about what that journey looked like then after the second.
So I honestly, I got really lucky, because I was already working in the laboratory. One of my coworkers was actually the person who worked in the lab at my OBGYN's office. And we do, we would talk a lot. She was the one that was always there running my blood tests when I did my doctor's visits and everything. So I had a really good relationship with her um, from that setting. And then uh, we really started talking more about the causes of miscarriage. I've always heard, it's probably chromosome issue. The baby wasn't going to make it anyway. Like it's not compatible with life is the term that they usually say. Um, but when I really started talking to her, she brought up like blood clotting issues. And it was something that I hadn't really considered, because I was so focused on other things. Because I previously had been diagnosed with endometriosis, I was going that route. Maybe that's the cause. Maybe it's all these other things. And so, um, when she brought up the actual blood clotting, that's when I said, "Oh, okay. Well, let me." It was really more of ruling it out and saying it's not blood clotting. So then when I was at work and one of my coworkers needed some blood to run some tests to make sure that her instrument was working properly. And so we went ahead and just ran my blood, again, to rule out, to say it's not a blood clot. And it turns out it was. And so then I told Lisa, my coworker that worked at the OBGYN's office, I reached out to her and I said, it it's blood clots. And she said, "Oh, do you mind if I tell your doctor?" I said, "Absolutely not." Next thing I knew, his nurse was calling me up and said, "Do you want to come down to the office so we can do more blood tests, or do you want us to send the orders over to you and you fax us back the results?" I said, "Just send them over. I'm at work. I'll fax you back the results." And sure enough, like that's how I figured out what was going on. And then when I got pregnant with my second child, my son, after that, all I had to do was take a low dose aspirin, a baby aspirin, and I had a perfectly healthy pregnancy. And it was that simple.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's incredible. If it wasn't the blood clots, like, so what other further testing can moms have done? Like, what are some of the other causes of miscarriage other than this blood clotting?
So one of the main causes, even for a single miscarriage, is the chromosomes. So basically, what happens uh, whenever the egg and the sperm come together, whenever the embryo is formed, we get half of our DNA from the father, half of our DNA from the mother, and then they come together and create this new person. um, but sometimes the DNA doesn't cross over properly, and so we end up, the term is called an aneuploidy, but you can end up then with an embryo that doesn't have the proper number of chromosomes. It may have too many, it may have too less. Um, And so that's the common cause. So what you can do in that situation to see if that's the cause is you can actually have a test known as karyotyping. And that's when doctors can look at the chromosomes of the mother and the father and see if there's a risk, if there's an abnormality, because sometimes we can carry changes in our chromosomes, we can carry changes in our DNAs, but because everything else is working fine, or where that location of the mutation is, we don't notice it and we'll never notice it until an issue comes up. And so by doing that karyotyping, we can visibly see the chromosomes of both the mother and the father. And then if the fetus is far enough along, they'll even do chromosome testing on that to figure out if that was absolutely the cause of the miscarriage. So that's a major one. Another one is hormone testing, because we have different hormones that stimulate different parts of the reproductive system. And we can figure out based on those hormone levels if the mother has a good egg reserve, so even the ability to get pregnant or underlying causes of infertility. We can do testing for another type of hormone known as progesterone, and that actually supports the uterine development to support the pregnancy. And that's also a very easy fix. We have synthetic progesterone that can be prescribed for, expectant mothers to support the pregnancy and make sure that they have those levels. So it really comes down to a few blood tests that we can do, which is great because that means it's not invasive. You don't have to go in. Of course, biopsies are an option. Ultrasound is an option, which is also not invasive, but there are some more invasive testing. But if you can do a blood test and figure out if it is or is not something, then at least that gives you something to start with or to go on.
Yeah, absolutely. So the karyotyping one that you were talking about,
Mhm.
is that done? I'm assuming that's done like after a miscarriage, that type
Usually,
of test. Okay.
but if there is a family history of miscarriage, you can you can get it done. And one of the things too that I don't think a lot of people realize is that you can request whatever test you want. Now it may be a situation where insurance will or will not pay for it based on certain criteria. Um, and it may be a situation where a doctor doesn't want to run a test because they don't think that you meet these criteria. But even in other situations, and I'm often the person that my family members call to go to their doctor appointments with them because I say, oh, well, I think you need to also, look at these things for whatever condition. And the doctor will say, why? And I'll list out the reasons and they say, oh, okay. And so go
Yeah,
ahead.
and also, well, and also just having a hard time getting pregnant. It's not like the
Right.
miscarriage, yes, but like women that have a hard time getting pregnant and resort to, IUI or IVF, that like maybe don't know to even ask for these types of tests to see if there's a different workaround other than just
Mhm.
fertility treatments, right?
Absolutely.
So like I have endometriosis as well, and I remember my doctor saying to me like, okay, like normally we have somebody try for a year before we do any sort of testing, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Fertility testing or whatnot. I got pregnant in 5 months, which was great, and had a healthy pregnancy and everything, but I wouldn't have known like what to ask for,
Mhm.
so what would you tell a mom? Like maybe she's having a hard time getting pregnant. It's taking longer than it's expected. What would you tell her to ask for? Because, you can't go to all of our doctor's appointments, Holly, like,
I'm
but they can,
free. I will make it happen.
but they can play this little clip on this episode. And that's why this podcast exists to, help women advocate for themselves. So what testing can they ask for before they're put on fertility treatments?
I would say first and foremost, the easiest test that should be requested is known as a TSH, and that's thyroid stimulating hormone. So the thyroid is, and the thyroid hormone is going to be the major contributor to metabolism in the body, but it handles so many things. We call it kind of like the master gland because it does so much without the body or within the body. And so the TSH, if somebody has a low level of thyroid hormone, they're not going to be able to get pregnant because the thyroid hormone interacts with the other reproductive hormones. And so you can look at that and figure out, quick and easy, is this the underlying cause? And actually, one of my friends, she went for years with infertility issues, finally found out she had a hypothyroid, which means that her thyroid hormone wasn't functioning properly or her thyroid gland wasn't functioning properly. And then as soon as she got that taken care of, she got pregnant with no problem. So that TSH is going to be, again, routine test most people can do. Um, you can also do testing for the reproductive hormones. And those are a bit more difficult because you need to do testing at least 2 weeks apart because our reproductive hormones, the levels change throughout the monthly cycle. And so if you just do one level, then you don't really have a reference point to know if it's high or low or normal. So, but FSH, which is the follicle stimulating hormone, is going to be one of the main ones that we use to determine if the female has a good egg reserve, and because that's going to stimulate that egg to be prepared for implantation. LH, which is luteinizing hormone, is going to be helpful as well. That's one of our reproductive hormones, and LH is going to be helpful because that tells us when right before conception can occur, when we enter that period, because it's just a very short window. And that's actually, you can test for that at home with a little gauge that looks at your saliva. So they actually sell those like Walgreens, Walmart. So that's a way that you can figure out, if you are even able to get pregnant that way. So those would be the main ones to start with. If those don't provide any good information, then the karyotyping would be helpful. And you can do mother and father for the karyotyping. If pregnancy can occur, but then the person experiences miscarriage, it can be that progesterone. Low progesterone levels means that the uterus isn't properly able to support the growth of the embryo and the fetus. And then the clotting test. There are several different tests for clotting that we can look at. And a lot of them even focus on if the female develops antibodies to platelets, which is kind of scary sounding. But at that point, yeah, you can form blood clots. And whenever that happens, the baby will start to develop, but they can't develop as quickly as they should. And that's what happened with me, was that, I had the heartbeat, I had the development, but it just wasn't developing as quickly, which is why they told me, oh, you're not as far along as you thought you were.
Right. Right. And you were, it's just that this
Mm-hmm.
clotting issue was causing the baby not to develop, and then eventually like this would have kept happening to you, it sounds
Mm-hmm.
like.
Yeah,
And so
absolutely.
that's crazy to think about too, because first pregnancy, no problem getting pregnant, keeping the pregnancy, and it's like
Mm-hmm.
you're probably like, what happened to my body? And do you think it's just because your body went through a pregnancy that now this clotting developed? Like, how does that happen? Like, because it didn't happen your first pregnancy, but now it's happening consecutive pregnancies.
Yeah, I wondered, and there were only 5 years in between my kids, and so I even went down the rabbit hole and said, is it because I'm older? But I wasn't considered an older mom. I was still under 30 when I had my second kid. And so I was like, well, that's weird. But then also another key point, or another key part of my story, I was adopted at birth, and I've since, it was private adoption, thankfully, but so I've met my biological parents, but it turns out that my paternal grandmother had a blood clotting disorder. So I found that
Wow.
out after my miscarriages, which is why family history is also important with this. And so then I found out she had a blood clotting disorder and died at an early age, but she had 10 kids. So, it's it's one of those things like when and how is it going to reveal itself?
Wild.
Yeah.
So would you, for a mom who's trying to conceive, maybe they've had a miscarriage or two, these are these tests for reproductive hormones, the karyotype, the clotting, these are all types of tests they can kind of exhaust before resorting to fertility treatments.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because those are going to be three of the main causes of miscarriage outside of any type of reproduction, like the system issue. If you don't have a physical, because sometimes the uterus can be prolapsed, or it can be you can have physical abnormalities. So aside from the physical abnormalities, which can be diagnosed through ultrasound and other means, and aside from lifestyle, uh, the karyotype, the reproductive hormones, and the clotting are going to be your three main causes of miscarriage.
But it sounds like without this information, like IUI or IVF may not even work if it's right. Like
Yeah.
if it's a hormonal issue, that's not gonna fix the problem.
Right. And so that is a major situation, which if a female has gone so far as getting the IUI or the IVF, in theory, and they should, the fertility clinic should test these things. Um, but you can also save the cost, you can save the headache, you can save the trouble, because the karyotyping is more of a specialized test, but the reproductive hormones and the blood clotting test, those aren't those aren't very specialized. So you can get those done usually at a local hospital, rather than having to go to a specialist and having to do all of these other things. One of the biggest setbacks in medicine that I, again, truly didn't understand until I worked in it for several years, is that most medical schools don't teach laboratory tests. And the reason that's such a big deal is because what we do constitutes about 70% estimated amount of information that the doctors are using to make diagnosis, to make prognosis, to determine treatment options, but yet they don't go to school to figure out what these lab tests are, what the results mean. They figure it out as they work. And so, if you're getting like an on the job training, what whoever trained you knows. And that was just such a wild realization for me, because you just think, you think, oh, doctors, nurse practitioners, they've had all these years of school, and they're experts and all of this. But that's where the advocacy comes in, because that's not necessarily the case, in every situation. So asking for those reproductive hormone tests, asking for those specific tests for blood clotting, and I'm happy to give you exact test names for the blood clotting. There tends to be more tests that can be done, and then the karyotyping. If those other two tests don't reveal anything, those are instrumental in figuring out causes of infertility and miscarriage.
Yeah, it's very eye-opening to go through yourself.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I wished I kind of wished I asked more questions. So I don't have experience with miscarriage or anything like that, but I had a very scary postpartum situation that I wish I knew I was high risk for. So I had retained placenta and I hemorrhaged at home at 3 weeks postpartum. And, after the fact, we had to do an emergency DNC and everything like that. But after the fact, was told that, because I have endometriosis, I'm at higher risk for retained placenta. And I'm like, why didn't anybody tell me that? Like,
Right.
so that when I was bleeding at home, I could have at least been like, okay, this is probably retained placenta. Like I could have been calm instead of being like, I'm dying. like you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
All I was told about endometriosis was that I might have a hard time getting pregnant, not that I was going to have a potential to have, retained placenta, which is very rare and I'd never heard of it before I experienced it. But that's why I talk about it, and that's why I have people like you on my podcast to talk about miscarriage and causes and blood tests to ask for,
yeah.
because our doctors are so smart, but they don't know everything, right?
Right. Absolutely. And they don't know your body. They don't know, they ask questions about your history, but they don't necessarily ask everything. And it could be a situation where you don't think about telling them. And then you're like,
Right.
oh,
Yeah.
by the
Oh, by
way.
the way, I have,
Right.
yeah, exactly. Because I've been pretty, like, my endometriosis has been pretty, like, in remission. Like, I haven't really
Mhm.
had issues. I had the surgery, ugh, I don't know, 8 years ago, like 8, 9 years ago, and I've been fine since, luckily. So I didn't think of that. But I'm like, oh
Right.
my gosh, like that's crazy to think about. But yeah, we just having more information is about our bodies when we go through such a crazy experience like pregnancy and postpartum. It's so needed. Having someone like you is so needed. So how can a mom be her best advocate trying to conceive or dealing, or if she's just dealt with a miscarriage or loss?
Oh, one, I would say, on a personal level, know that it's okay. The grieving part is a very real part. And I think that a lot of people want to skip over it, and a lot of the people close to us want us to skip over it. Um, but that's the biggest thing. You have to allow yourself time to grieve, time to really process it. There's a lot of, there's the physical side, there's the mental side, but there's also this emotional side. And that's the big thing. It goes back to the whole saying, you can't pour from an empty vessel. And so you can't advocate for yourself if you haven't given yourself that space to really go through that experience and to get through that experience. Reaching out to others, and that's a very difficult thing for me. um, I am more introverted, but I also feel like I should be able to know something. I should be able to bounce back. I should be able, why can't I do this type thing? Um, so just again, allowing that space first and foremost. But after that, I mean, just even with the list that, I provided, looking into the hormones, and based on their own personal bodies, based on their own personal experiences, they may be able to say, oh, well, I think that this might be it, or I don't think that this is it. And, I went through thinking, oh, it's not going to be the blood clots, it's going to be my endometriosis. So again, sometimes we're not right, even when we do this for a living. Um, but yeah, just really exploring. Everybody says don't go to WebMD, don't Google it, but sometimes it does provide helpful information. Uh, the trick is to not spiral, not go too far down the rabbit hole.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, really going through, especially for the thyroid. If somebody has an underfunctioning thyroid, they tend to have trouble with losing weight. They tend to have certain types of symptoms and signs to where, somebody can go through and say, you know what, this does kind of describe me. So that would be the first step, is really looking into it, and then asking the doctor. And hopefully everybody will have a doctor like mine who is not afraid to say I don't know. And that was, I honestly say that was one of the biggest parts for me, because I'm okay with I don't know. I'm not okay with somebody making up something or feel like I'm threatening them because I'm questioning them. But we should, as patients, we should be equal contributors to our health because we're the ones who know us the best. And so if somebody runs into a situation where they feel like they're being dismissed by their doctor or their nurse practitioner, get a new one. And honestly, that's how I ended up with the doctor I had now, because I had an OBGYN with my first pregnancy, and she was very dismissive of my endometriosis symptoms. And I went to her a couple of times and really tried to talk to her about it. And again, she was very dismissive. So I said, fine, I found somebody else. And 2 weeks after I saw him for the first time, he was doing the laparoscopy for my endometriosis. So really don't be afraid to shop around. Don't be afraid to find somebody that you can trust and that you feel does have your best interest at heart.
100%. And that goes for so many things, not
Mhm.
just right. I mean, pelvic health symptoms. That was another thing for me. Like I had one pelvic floor physical therapist, and I couldn't get past a certain threshold of my symptoms. And instead of her being like, you know what, this is as far as I can get you. I think you need to, you know, go further. She was making me think that that was as far as I was going to go. Like I wasn't
Mhm.
going to improve anymore. And I refused to believe that. So I shopped around. So I love that you said that about providers that are, when it comes to any like miscarriage, like you said, or endometriosis or just pelvic health symptoms. It's so important that we ask questions and don't accept being gaslighted by these providers because they're like, well, I'm smarter than you. Well, it's like, well, I know my body best, really.
Exactly.
So, where can people find you or reach out to you if they have questions, especially, maybe the specific blood clotting tests? Maybe that's something that they're like, oh, like I really need to get some of those tests. Where can people find you?
Let me give you my work email address,
Okay.
because I always have that on, and I can check it from anywhere. So it's Holly, HOLLY Covas, COVAS, and that's at VUMC.org. So Vanderbilt University Medical Center.org.
And where are you located, Holly?
So I'm in Spring Hill, just south of Nashville, but I go to Nashville every day for work.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here. I'll also put your contact info in the show notes so that people can reference it if they need to later on. But
Awesome.
again, thank you so much for being here. And I know that this is going to have a big impact and help so many women. So thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. This is something that ever since my miscarriages, I've been saying, oh, I want to write a book for patients, not for the doctors, that's at this level. So I appreciate, obviously, I haven't gotten around to that yet. So I appreciate being able to at least talk about it and hopefully share information that will help somebody.
Absolutely. Now go write that book because we need it.
I'll
Thank,
get right on it.
yeah,
Thank
thank you for
you.
listening, everybody.